episode of Pyathlon. Today we'll be talking about getting input from the user of your program. So, we recently discussed how you can use variables to store data. And when you use user input, you'll often want to store the input that the user gives you in a variable. So, let's talk about what that might look like. So remember, every time you want to create a variable in Python, you have the variable name, the equal sign, and then a value or expression that your variable will be set equal to. So let's say we want to get some input from the user and store the user's input in a variable called user underscore input. We'll be using snake case in this lesson. So let's create our variable user underscore input equals. And in order to get user input in Python, there's a pre-built function that already does that for you, and it's called input. So you just type input, and then you have a set of parentheses. Now, what goes into these parentheses will be a string, and that string is what your program will ask the user in order to get the user input. What goes into this parentheses would be the prompt that you're prompting your user for. So let's say we would like to ask the user, what is your age? So we'll just say, what is your age? And remember, since this is a string, it has to be in quotes. It can be single or double quotes. So we'll just run this cell and see what happens. You'll see it says, what is your age? And it gives you a text box where you can add your user input. I also want to bring your attention to the side of the cell over here. You'll see this asterisk right here, and that means your cell is currently running. But more on that later. So we'll say, what is your age? We'll just say 50 and hit enter. And then let's print user underscore input right here. And it says 50. So let's go back and run this again. But this time, instead of running these two cells separately, we're going to both run them before we put in our user input. And we'll see what happens. The second time we tried to run the cell, the text box went away. And when we print user input, it doesn't say anything because this input was set and we didn't input anything, which is why this variable no longer has any output. So when you use user input in Jupyter notebooks, you want to make sure you actually get the user input before you run the next cell. Alright, so let's run these two again. We'll say 50 again and hit enter. We'll print user input and it's 50. Now here's something I want to bring your attention to. Let's look at the type of user input. And it's a string. Every time you use this input function, the output type is always going to be a string. Now, if you have a variable type that you would like to convert to another variable type, that process is called casting. And in Python, you can cast a variable by the data type that you want to convert it to. You can type that. So let's say we like to convert user input. We'll call this user input integer. And let's say we want to convert user input to an integer number. So we'll have the data type we want to convert it to, integer, or int for short. In Python, if you want to refer to an integer, you just say int. And then in parentheses, you have the variable you want to convert, which would be user input. And then let's print user input integer. And you'll see it's 50. And let's look at the type of this variable. You'll see it's an integer. Now, let's say they entered something. Let's say they entered a float for user input. So let's do 50.0, enter. When you print it, it's 50.0. And the type, once again, is string. Okay, so let's run this cell again and make our user input integer variable. And it says invalid literal for int with base 10. And then it tells you the value of the variable. We're trying to cast a string to an integer, but the string is not an integer. It doesn't contain an integer value. When it was just 50, this can work fine. But since it's 50.0, we're trying to cast a string that contains a float to an int. And that's why this code does not work. So one way we can get around this is change this to float. Remember, float is a floating point number. It's a decimal number. So now let's run this cell. And that ran fine. We'll print it. It's 50.0. We'll look at the type, and it's a float. Now there's one function that I would like to introduce you to, and it's called the isNumeric function. And this function will return a Boolean value. Remember, Boolean is true or false. And it will return true if every thing inside of the string you're calling it on is numeric. Otherwise, it returns false. So we'll create a test str, so our test string, and we'll call this I am 50 years old. We'll run that. I'm not actually 50 years old, but that's what our test string says. So let's see if this is numeric. We can do test str that is underscore numeric. Sorry, there's not a underscore between this. It just is numeric. And this says false because it's not numeric. It's alphanumerical. There are words and letters in here. So let's change this to just say 50. And run that. And let's run this isNumeric function again. And this time it's true because everything in here is numeric. Let's change this to 50.0 and try it again. And it says false because it doesn't treat the decimal as a number. It's treating the decimal as something from the alphabet. It's alphanumerical value, not a numerical value. So using this isNumeric function can be really good if you're doing something like what we did here, where you're getting user input. Let's say you wanted to only accept the user input if it was completely numeric. That would be a good way to validate the user's age and make sure that they're only inputting valid values. And you can do that using an if statement, which is what we'll talk about in the next video.